Hello, Little Falls. It's just Jeffrey joining you for this episode of Historic New Jersey. And today we are bringing you to Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson.
All the famous people that made Paterson are right here in Cedar Lawn.
So, how long has this cemetery been here? How long has it been operational?
Actually, we're going to go to the very first interment. So this cemetery begins in 1867. It's really a group of citizens in 1865, and actually they're all buried here too, created the Cedar Cliff Cemetery Association. This was in response to what happened with the original burial grounds, which were the Sandy Hill cemeteries. Today, the remnant of them, where Eastside High School is, and they call themselves the Ghosts,
Yes.
because they're built on the former Presbyterian
Really?
cemetery. And really, the very first park in Paterson is Cedar Lawn Cemetery. We don't have a public park until about 1890.
Oh, wow.
So this is, not only would you come to see Grandma and Grandpa, but it actually, led all the way to the Passaic River. So it was really
And
lovely.
you'd have a picnic with them.
Why not?
Excellent. So, let's go around. Let's check out some of the notable residents of Cedar Lawn.
So underneath this monument is Captain Hugh Irish, and he is actually very famous in Paterson. He was a newspaperman originally, and in 1862 he decided to raise a company of volunteers for the Union Army, and then they made him the captain. But unfortunately, he didn't last for very long. In less than a month, he was actually killed in action. That was September 17th, 1862 at the Battle of Antietam.
Wow.
But he was considered a very big hero at Antietam and in Paterson. He is the person who is featured on top of the monument for the New Jersey soldiers at Antietam.
I know a lot about Charles Danforth, of course, and my life is kind of tied into him. My very first job, which actually I'm technically still working at, was at the Paterson Free Public Library. When you walk into that main edifice on 250 Broadway, it's the Danforth Memorial Library, and it's named in honor of Charles Danforth.
Oh.
He was originally born in Massachusetts. He did serve in the War of 1812, and then he bounced around Massachusetts in the cotton industry. But he also had a bit of an engineering flair. So he was working on developing cotton spinning machinery. And he settled down in Paterson about 1828, where he comes in contact with the firm of Godwin, Rogers, and Clark. They're machinists. And he gives them his designs, and they start building what would be the Danforth frame. Later, they would also be building silk frames. He takes this invention, of all things, goes to England with it, where he, markets it there, sells them the rights, and he's in Manchester for a few years while he's making his fortune. Comes back to Paterson, about 1831 or so, and then he opens Charles Danforth and Company. And he's building
Right
textile
here in
machines.
Paterson.
Right here in Paterson. Actually, diagonal from the Paterson Museum.
So this is Charles Danforth Jr., and he volunteered very early in the beginning of the American Civil War for the state of New Jersey, and he served in the Union. He was one of roughly 200 Civil War soldiers from Paterson that lost their lives during that conflict. And he actually tragically died. He fell at the Battle of Gaines' Mill in Virginia, which was part of the Peninsula Campaign, and that was in 1862.
This is Mary Elizabeth Danforth, and she married William Ryle. So this is locomotive money marrying silk money. Although her husband dies rather young, and she actually becomes one of the most philanthropic individuals in Paterson's history. The main thing she really did for us is really give us the home of the Paterson Free Public Library.
Another library connection.
It had a big connection. The very first free public library in the state of New Jersey is the city of Paterson. Library law was enacted or introduced by William Prawl, who was our assemblyman at the time, although he honors his wife Lillian as credited for, who gave him the inspiration to, design the legislation. So Paterson adopts it. 1885, they're renting a little place on Church Street, the old Stimson House. It was 54 Church Street at the time. And a couple years later, Mary's mom passes away. Their ancestral home was right on the corner of Market and Church Street. It's where the Alexander Hamilton Hotel stands today. And she wrote a letter to the Board of Trustees saying that this experiment seems to be working out well. So she'd like to donate her parents' house and the money it would take to retrofit it to make it a library.
Jack, tell us about this amazing, amazing headstone.
Well, let me tell you one thing. Paterson's known as the Silk City. Without Mr. John Ryle, we would have no Silk City. John Ryle grew up in Bowlington, England. He was born about 1817. And he learned the trade by about the age of 5. He started working in the silk. Actually, he was one of 17 children that his parents had, but only
Oh, wow.
5 reached adulthood, including Reuben and William, who would own extensive silk mills in Macclesfield, England. John Ryle comes over to America, 1839, I guess to look to make his own fortune.
Right.
He ends up in Northampton, Massachusetts, at a gentleman named Samuel Whitmarsh, who was running a silk mill. Ran it for a little bit, but then he came back to New York on Maiden Lane, and he opened up a little shop where he was selling finished product of his brother's over in England. But while he was in Northampton, he had met a gentleman by the name of George Murray, who was about 80 at the time. He made his money developing the pigment for whitewashing, and he loved textiles. He was in Paterson at the old gun mill where Sam Colt actually made the very first revolvers. Really? On the upper floor, the attic floor, Christopher Colt, Christopher Jr., brought some textile machinery down from their father, Christopher Sr., who had, up until about 1838 was running the Connecticut Silk Works. He ran it for about 3 months and abandoned it. So it was left, left alone. And then George Murray saw it. And I remember meeting John Ryle. He brought him there. John Ryle looked and says, yeah, I can get this running. So the very first successful spinning of silk onto bobbins, and it would be continuous, begins about 1839, 1840. For about 20 years, Ryle's sewing threads are our major industry in the silk, because we were still cotton town at the time.
Amazing.
So Julian Rix was an American landscape artist. He painted starting in the late 1860s in California, and he lived in an artist colony in Monterey.
Very cool.
Yeah, but why is he in New Jersey, of course, is the big question. He actually experienced a lot of financial problems, as many artists did in the late 1870s, when this country was having a depression. And an industrialist from Paterson, Mr. William Ryle, reached out to him. He was a fan and said, come to New Jersey and I'll give you a space in my home to paint. And so Julian Rix took him up on it. The two became lifelong friends. Ryle helped him start a studio in New York City. And then when Rix died prematurely of kidney problems in 1903, Ryle had his friend buried next to him.
So Heather, here we are with the stone of Nicholas Murray Butler. Could you tell us something about him?
Sure. So he was the longest standing president of Columbia University. And in 1931, he won a Nobel Peace Prize, which he shared with Jane Addams.
That's incredible. This is a very, very familiar name, the Lamberts of
Lambert Castle.
Yes.
Well, that's what we call it today. So Cathalina Lambert and his family are buried here in their plot. And when he owned the house and built it, they called it Bella Vista. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
It means beautiful view, but it was also a bit of a play on his wife Isabella's name. And we today know it obviously as Lambert Castle. And that's probably what he's more well known for, his castle and also his art collection, although he was a silk manufacturer, which is where he got all of his money. And buried here, besides he and his wife, well, both of his wives, are also most of his family. He had several children who died very young, which was very sad.
One of the most unique monuments to grace Cedar Lawn Cemetery would be the Barbour plot, particularly the monument that was erected here by Colonel William Barbour. He actually won the title Colonel. It was bestowed upon him by John W. Griggs when he was part of his staff when he was the governor of the state of New Jersey. Barbour, he would tell this story when he was a penniless young man, that he walked from Dover to Newton and he stopped and had lunch on this giant boulder, which originally weighed about 100 tons. Although he was quickly called out on it because he came to Paterson with a silver spoon. His family in Ireland had the Barbour flax spinning mills, linen mills, and actually I think he's one of the wealthiest men in the cemetery. When he passed, he was worth about $600 million to $700 million in today's equivalent. Anyway, he was desirous to bring this to his family plot. And the Lackawanna did not want to move it. They were going to put it on a special cart. So he had to make a concession as he lopped off about 30 tons of it. So now it's only a 70-ton memorial. They built a special train for it. A car came by train to Paterson. It cost in total about $10,000, or almost $350,000 to get this here to place on its property. And that is his signature, which we can confirm. So that's Colonel William Barbour. Timothy Crane, like actually many of the people who are buried here, were actually reinterred. He was originally was buried at Sandy Hill cemeteries. But what's significant about him, and I think it's rather timely, is in 1827, he actually erected the first bridge over the falls. Today we have the 5th and 6th bridge, and up until a couple of weeks ago, the 6th bridge was still in place. It's just recently been removed. They're going to be putting a new bridge so we can cross it again, but it all started with Timothy Crane in September of 1827. What's unique also that happened during that day when he was having his opening ceremonies, there was a little disruption on the other side of the falls, and that's where the famous Jersey jumper Sam Patch began his career, where he would leap over and into the falls. Sam Patches has the distinction of being the only person to successfully jump into Niagara unaided and survive. However, his career was cut briefly. As you can imagine, not a great occupation. He dies a couple years later jumping over Genesee Falls and outside of Rochester. Timothy Crane, for the last thing, is also our very first fire chief from the Volunteer Corps.
Jack, tell us about Roswell Colt.
Okay, well, the Colt name is pretty familiar. As you can imagine, everybody knows Sam Colt, the inventor of the revolver. Well, he didn't really invent it, but that's another story. The greatest of the Colts, at least in terms of Paterson, would be Roswell Colt. Roswell Colt really ascends to become the governor of the SUM. That's pretty much who ran the town, and laid out the raceway system and promoted manufacturing. Quite different than what Alexander Hamilton had in mind as this national manufacturing. Actually, Roswell Colt became like the first power broker, sort of like PSE&G.
Right.
He had the raceway system, so he could supply power because you needed water power to turn, water wheels. That's actually what powered the early works. Actually, from 1794 until 1859, everything ran off the raceway. Roswell would run the SUM from 1814 up until 1856 when he passes. That's the Society for Establishing Useful Manufacturers. They're the ones who got the first charter and actually created Paterson. And the Colt family itself would run them directly or through marriage up to about 1899, when they go on another 46 years before they get absorbed by the city of Paterson. This unfortunate scene is the remnants of Peter Colt's grave. Peter Colt was actually the very first Colt here. He was brought by the SUM to supersede Pierre L'Enfant and do the basic layout of the city that we have to this day and the beginnings of the raceway system. He was originally the treasurer for the state of Connecticut before, we hired him. And, it's a sad irony over time that the architect of the city of Paterson's grave lies in ruins.
Under this gravestone is Nancy Fletcher, who has the honor of being the first interment here in Cedar Lawn Cemetery, 1867. Buried in this very large mausoleum, the largest mausoleum here at Cedar Lawn Cemetery, is the Hobart family. Garrett Hobart was the 24th Vice President of the United States, and he served with President William McKinley until he passed away in 1899. Buried with him as well is his wife, who I personally think is more important, at least to Paterson, Jenny Tuttle Hobart. She survived her husband by 42 years, and in those years she filled her time with all sorts of philanthropic causes, which are too long to go on right now, but one of the ones that's most, I think, significant is forming the Memorial Day Nursery, which is still in operation in Paterson to this day.
Actually, there's a connection with this mausoleum and the Memorial Day Nursery, and that both of them go back to that famous architect who designed the building for the Paterson Free Public Library, Henry Bacon. Henry Bacon designed this. It was ready in 1902, 2 years, unfortunately, after Hobart died, because he died unexpectedly. So he was in the receiving vault waiting for his mausoleum to be made.
So, Heather, for me, this is the piece de resistance. This is an unmarked grave. And what is so significant about this unmarked grave?
So in this unmarked grave is a woman named Betty Gray. Well, at least that was her stage name. She was born Lily Peterson from Passaic, and she was a model who was on the vaudeville stage and became a silent movie star. From 1912 to 1918, she starred in a bunch of silent movies, but unfortunately, her life was cut short very tragically. She caught influenza during the pandemic. In 1919, she died in her early 20s.
What a shame. And do we know why it's unmarked?
I don't know why. I don't think she had much family, and I think even though she was a silent movie star, I don't know that she had that much money when she passed. So I don't know why she's...
So I want to thank Jack and Heather from the Paterson Museum for giving us this wonderful tour of Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson. And we will be back for a part 2 because there's a lot to see. And we barely scratched the surface. So we will be back. So stay tuned for that episode. Thank you so much, guys.